Have you ever wondered how the Roman army, often outnumbered, managed to conquer vast territories and defeat powerful enemies? The secret was not just in their rigorous training but in their unconventional and often crazy tactics, which ensured victory in battle. Remember, the Roman army wasn't always the powerhouse we think it was. They faced formidable enemies, many of whom had superior resources. From the mighty Carthaginian fleets to the fierce Gaulish tribes and Germanic warriors, the Romans had to deal with some of the most formidable forces in history. These enemies had their own advantages, whether in numbers, knowledge of the terrain, or superior weaponry. The Romans couldn't just rely on strength. They had to be clever and outmaneuver their opponents. Imagine yourself on the battlefield, facing an enemy, knowing your army is smaller and resources are limited. How could they achieve victory against so many challenges? The answer lies in their ingenuity and willingness to employ tactics that were as bold as they were effective. These weren't just simple battle strategies. They were daring moves that required precision, discipline, and a dose of cruelty. Let's explore some of the tactics that made the Roman army an unstoppable force. Imagine being a Roman soldier on the battlefield, knowing that failure meant not only your death but the death of 1 in every 10 of your comrades. The Romans faced incredible challenges in maintaining discipline among their troops, especially after a devastating defeat. How did they ensure that their soldiers wouldn't desert or revolt? The Roman answer was the brutal tactic of decimation. It wasn't just a spontaneous act of cruelty but a structured policy to maintain order and discipline. What made decimation particularly Roman was its systematic application. The Romans were meticulous organizers and institutionalized this severe punishment as part of their military discipline laws. They turned an extreme measure into a structured policy, making sure every soldier knew the potential consequences of failure. The risk was huge. Executing 1 in every 10 soldiers could demoralize a unit and create resentment. However, the Romans believed the benefits of maintaining ironclad discipline outweighed these concerns. A documented decimation occurred during the campaign against Spartacus in 71 before Christ. After a series of defeats and a particularly dangerous retreat, Crassus decided to restore discipline by decimating a cohort that had shown cowardice. This brutal punishment had a profound psychological impact on the remaining soldiers. Seeing the severe consequences of failure, the men fought with greater determination and loyalty, which significantly contributed to Spartacus' defeat. Decimation, though rare, proved to be an extremely effective method of maintaining order. If you are enjoying this journey through history, do not forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us keep bringing content like this. During the First Punic War, the Romans faced the formidable challenge of Carthage's superior fleets. The Carthaginians had faster, more agile ships and greater naval experience. How could the Romans, who were essentially a land force, compete on the open seas and win naval battles? The Roman solution was the ingenious but risky invention of the corvus. This invention turned naval combat into something more familiar to the Romans: hand-to-hand battles. The corvus was essentially a movable bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to board and engage in hand-to-hand combat. This tactic played to the Romans' strengths, bringing their superior combat skills to the seas. What made this tactic particularly Roman was the innovative use of engineering to overcome strategic disadvantages. The corvus turned naval battles into infantry confrontations, a field in which the Romans excelled. The risk was great. It made their ships less stable and more vulnerable in rough waters, but its potential to transform naval battles was revolutionary. The effectiveness of the corvus was spectacularly demonstrated at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. Despite facing a more experienced fleet, the Romans used the corvus to capture Carthaginian ships, securing a decisive victory. By turning naval combat into hand-to-hand battles, this tactic caught the Carthaginians off guard and allowed the Romans to dominate naval warfare. This was a game-changer, ensuring Roman dominance in the First Punic War and proving that Roman innovation could overcome even the most daunting challenges. During the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar found himself in a critical situation at the city of Alesia. He not only had to besiege a well-defended city, but also face a Gallic relief force approaching from the outside. How could Caesar secure a victory against such overwhelming odds? Caesar's answer was a brilliant strategy that involved building double fortifications. He ordered his men to build a wall to contain the besieged forces and another outer wall to repel the Gallic relief army. This tactic was innovative in its scope, addressing both the internal threat and external attacks simultaneously. The risk was enormous. Any breach in either wall could spell disaster, but Caesar's planning and his troops' discipline made this bold move possible, and the double fortifications of Alesia proved to be a masterpiece. Even while under siege, the Romans held their ground. The inner wall prevented the besieged from escaping, while the outer wall repelled the Gallic forces that repeatedly tried to break through and rescue their comrades. After days of failed attempts, the relief army was finally defeated, leading to the surrender of those inside the city. The Siege of Alesia is one of the most famous examples of Roman ingenuity and skill in turning adverse situations into spectacular victories. But not all Roman strategies involve direct confrontation and brute force. In various regions the Romans sought to control, they often faced powerful alliances and united fronts that made expansion difficult. How could they overcome unified opposition and maintain control over various regions? The Romans mastered the art of divide and conquer, a strategy rooted in psychological warfare and shrewd diplomacy. They recognized that a united enemy was much harder to defeat than fragmented factions. To exploit this, they would foment dissent and rivalries between enemy tribes or states, preventing alliances from forming against them. What made this tactic particularly Roman was its systematic and calculated approach to diplomacy. They would often form temporary alliances with certain factions, offering incentives or exploiting existing tensions to weaken ties between their enemies. The Romans would first weaken the bonds between their enemies through strategic diplomacy, and then strike decisively when their opponents were most vulnerable. However, this strategy wasn't without significant risks. It required deep knowledge of local politics and a delicate balance of force and persuasion. A notable example of the divide and conquer strategy was during the Roman conquest of Britain. The Romans faced resistance from the Britons, who were united under powerful leaders like Cassivellaunus during Caesar's campaigns, and later under Caratacus during Claudius' reign. To overcome this resistance, the Romans exploited rivalries between the various British tribes. By forming alliances with some tribes and isolating others, the Romans were able to defeat their strongest opponents individually. For example, during Caesar's second expedition, the Romans allied with the Trinovantes, who were rivals of the Catuvellauni, led by Cassivellaunus. This alliance provided Caesar with intelligence and additional forces, helping the Romans defeat Cassivellaunus and secure a foothold, albeit temporary, in Britain. Later, during Claudius' reign, these strategies of exploiting rivalries continued, allowing the Romans to consolidate their control over Britain. By dividing and conquering, the Romans isolated and subdued their enemies, demonstrating their ability to combine psychological warfare with military strategy. Despite the risks involved, this tactic allowed them to methodically expand their empire and maintain control over diverse and often hostile territories. And so, brothers and sisters, we come to the end. These ingenious and often risky tactics show the ingenuity and effectiveness of the Romans in turning challenges into victories, leaving a legacy of one of the greatest empires in history. Dive deeper into history by watching many of our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments below.